The void is silent, but silence is no comfort when the Tyranids are near. They are not an enemy you can reason with, nor a foe that can be bribed, bartered, or broken. They are hunger given flesh, a living tide that knows neither pause nor mercy. Imagine a world full of voices, prayers, and the sound of life carried on the winds of 1,000 cities. Now imagine that sound drawn away in an instant, like air sucked from a dying man's lungs. When the Tyranids arrive, they do not invade in the way other armies do. They do not conquer. They do not occupy. They consume everything. Stone, soil, bone, and soul, all stripped bare until nothing remains but dust and silence. This is the fate that awaits every world that finds itself caught in the path of the great devourer. And tonight, we step into that darkness to witness the story of one such world, devoured piece by piece until there was nothing left to remember it by. If this journey into the abyss of Warhammer's most merciless predators grips you, then join me here among the shadows. Subscribe to this channel, lend your voice to the growing chorus, and let's keep walking together through the endless night of the 41st millennium. For months, the people of Lethus 4 had spoken of strange glimmers that swam across the void above them. At first, they were no more than faint streaks of light, mistaken for comets or drifting debris. The kind of phenomena that farmers pointed out to their children before returning to the work of the fields. But the streaks did not fade. They multiplied. They thickened. Soon, the skies themselves seemed restless, as though the heavens carried a sickness. Astropaths spoke of interference that clawed at their minds. Whenever they reached for the Astronomicon, their voices cracked in council chambers as they described dreams of an endless chittering chorus, of oceans of flesh stretching beyond reason. Administratum clerks recorded the reports dutifully, stamping the parchment with the imperial aquila before filing it away. Their quills scratching faster than their hearts could accept. The official stance was clear. There was no danger. The hive fleets were far away, locked in wars across other sectors. The Thesaphore was a minor agri-world, a cog that turned unnoticed in the Imperium's vast machinery. Surely, they said, the shadows in the sky were nothing more than celestial drift, yet the signs continued to spread. The cattle in the pastures grew restless, their eyes rolling in terror at sounds no human ear could hear. Flocks of avian creatures that had flown in ordered patterns for generations now twisted into frenzied spirals. Before collapsing from the skies like burning cinders, entire fishing communities spoke of the ocean itself retreating, tides dragging out unnaturally far before returning in a crash that left beaches strewn with alien carcasses none could name. The ecclesiarchy was quick to seize upon these omens. Preachers filled the plazas of the hive cities with booming hymns, their words declaring that this was a test of faith, that the emperor had sent portents to harden the hearts of his children. And though many clutched their relics tighter, repeating catechisms to drown their fear, others looked skyward with dread. They dared not speak aloud. For faith was meant to comfort, yet even in the strongest prayers, a whisper lingered. What if these were not signs of trial, but warnings of doom? The planetary governor, Lord Hellion Verost, gave his speeches with the calm polish of a man determined to believe his own lies. He stood before the picked recorders, wrapped in robes heavy with gilt thread, assuring his people that reinforcements from the Astra Militarum were always near, that the Imperium's watchful eye never faltered. But behind his words was the truth of every forgotten world. Terra was distant, and the Imperium's gaze rarely lingered on the weak. Lethus 4 was but one more grain of dust upon the galaxy's endless surface. Still, life carried on, as it must. Farmers plowed fields under a sky that seemed darker each day. Manufactorums spat smoke, their servitors trudging tirelessly through tasks they could not question. The markets bustled, filled with spice sellers and artificers, as though the rhythm of daily survival might drown out the unease crawling beneath it all. Yet beneath that rhythm beat a quiet desperation, the kind that gnaws unseen until it finally breaks through and screams. The first true scream came from the deep ranges, where miners in the northern wastes uncovered caverns honeycombed with tunnels not made by human hands. At first, they marveled at the precision of the walls, smooth and wet, as though carved by some great machine. But the deeper they ventured, the more they realized that the stone itself seemed alive, faintly pulsing with residual warmth. When the first bodies were discovered, half dissolved, their bones softened into pulp, the miners sealed the shafts in terror. The report they sent to the governor's palace never received reply. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some whispered that the Adeptus Mechanicus had birthed a secret experiment beneath the crust. A biotechnological project escaped from control. Others swore they saw shapes moving in the night, vast silhouettes blotting the stars as though the constellations themselves were being devoured. And among the astropaths, silence began to grow. Those who once sang the Emperor's light into the void now huddled in their chambers, their tongues stilled, their eyes bleeding from visions they could not describe. It was then that the dreams began. Not just among the psychers, but among ordinary men and women who had never once felt the brush of the warp. They woke in the dark of night, gasping for breath, certain that they had been buried alive beneath oceans of flesh. Children screamed in their sleep, clawing at their faces as though insects writhed beneath their skin. Families burned incense, daubed symbols of the Aquila across their doors, prayed louder and louder, but still the dreams returned. Denial cracked slowly, like ice splitting under weight. The governor issued new decrees forbidding the spread of false rumors, punishable by flogging and servitude. Ecclesiarchy priests declared the dreams to be temptations of chaos, demanding stricter worship and harsher penance. Yet even as punishments grew, the whispers did not stop. A people can endure hardship, famine, even war, but they cannot endure the feeling of being already dead while still alive. And so the people of Lethus IV carried on beneath a sky that seemed to shrink closer each night, wrapped in a silence heavier than faith. They did not yet see the swarm. They did not yet know the taste of chitin and acid, or the sound of a billion wings tearing air itself apart. But in their hearts, they had already begun to sense the truth, that what watched them from the void was not a storm that would pass, but a hunger that would never be satisfied. The nights grew longer, though the planet's orbit had not changed. People noticed it in their bones before they saw it in the heavens, a heaviness that pressed against the lungs, as though the very air grew reluctant to be breathed. In the grand cathedra of Hive Varan, the priests lit every lumen and torch they could find, drowning the nave in firelight to prove that darkness could still be mastered. Yet beyond the cathedral doors, the city's spires glowed faintly under a pallid haze. The stars above veiled as if the void itself wished to hide what was coming in the governor's palace. Varus convened his council in chambers that stank of recycled incense and fierce sweat. Vox reports from the orbital stations had grown erratic, static-filled, as though the air between ship and world were being swallowed by some unseen veil. One by one, patrol craft failed to return from their sweeps. The few fragments of data slates that trickled back told the same tale. Vast shadow forms drifting at the edges of sensor range, too large to classify, too swift to track. The Mechanicus adepts insisted the readings were malfunctions. The soldiers stationed at the bastion gates whispered otherwise. By then, the dreams had sharpened. They no longer showed oceans of indistinct flesh, but clear images of teeth that dripped like knives, of claws tearing through iron, of eyes that were not eyes at all, but pits of bottomless hunger. What made the visions unbearable was not their alien strangeness, but their familiarity. Men and women woke convinced they had already been there. They had lived those moments and died 100 deaths already. And when they closed their eyes again, the cycle began anew. On the fringes of the hives, the first disappearances began. Families who had traveled out into the farmlands for supplies never returned. Patrols sent to find them reported strange trails etched into the soil, shallow grooves where something heavy had slithered or dragged itself across the earth. The marks often led to pools of viscous fluid that corroded whatever it touched. By the time squads returned with samples for study, the pools had hardened into brittle crusts, flaking away like dead skin. The Magos biologist tasked with the samples declared them inconclusive. Though his hand shook so violently he could not hold the data slate steady. Still, the governor spoke of stability. Still, the priests thundered of faith. Yet on the streets, mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers sharpened blades they had not drawn in years. and servitors labored silently as though even their machine-stunted souls had begun to anticipate an end. The denial that had shielded Lethus was wearing thin. The Fafade was cracking. The first great sign came in the form of a storm. At dusk, the skies over the southern hemisphere blackened with a suddenness that no augur could predict. Winds screamed across the plains, tearing banners from their poles, driving animals mad with terror. But it was not wind alone that raged. Amid the storm's heart fell shapes like rain. Small at first, organic pods that streaked fire across the heavens before burrowing into soil with concussive force. The land shuddered beneath the impacts. And though no one yet understood the truth, the first spores of the Tyranid vanguard had seeded themselves upon the planet, in the hives. Panic was met with lashes and fire. The Adeptus Arbites marched the streets in full riot plate, shock malls crackling as they drove citizens back into their hab blocks. Voxcasters blared with proclamations that all was well, that the storms were natural phenomena, that order would be preserved. But every man and woman who had seen the pods fall knew better. A storm may pass. This one had taken root. Children began coughing blood in the lower habs, their bodies wasting with a fever no Medicaid could cure. Crops that had stood tall for months withered overnight, their roots turned black, their stalks riddled with unseen parasites. Herds of groks stampeded into rivers, drowning themselves in mass rather than face the unseen scent that tormented them. And still, the governor delayed the distress call. Fearing the stain of cowardice more than the certainty of extinction, only the astropaths knew how little time remained. Those who still dared to reach into the warp found nothing but a wall of static, a shrieking pressure that drowned even their innermost thoughts. One by one, their minds snapped, leaving them husks that twitched and whispered in tongues no man could understand. Before long, the choir tower of Hive Varen had fallen utterly silent by then. Some dared to speak the name that had haunted their dreams. Tyranid. It passed in whispers between soldiers at their posts, between workers at the manufactorum, between children who no longer trusted their elders' comforts. Tyranid. The word spread like contagion, filling the silence with dread until even those who had once proclaimed absolute denial found themselves, unable to say anything else. Tyranid. The name of hunger itself. And as the word took hold, the last illusions of safety fell away. For in their hearts, the people of Lethus IV understood the truth they had tried to ignore. Shadows were not omens. Shadows were teeth, waiting to close. The first confirmed sighting came not from soldiers or officers, but from a child. In the outskirts of Hive Kethrin, a girl named Lyra wandered from her hablock at dawn, chasing the faint glow of something she thought was a lantern flickering in the fog. When her mother found her, the child was screaming, her eyes wide and bloodshot, her voice cracking as she tried to describe a creature that crawled on too many limbs, its skin glistening as if it had been birthed in slime. It had no face, she said, only a mouth that never stopped moving, as though chewing on air itself. Most dismissed her account as the dream fragments of a frightened mind. But when the enforcers searched the fog-choked alley, they found a trail of ichor leading away from the hive walls, steaming where it touched stone. By the next week, sightings multiplied. Hunters in the southern plains failed to return, their vox signals ending in shrieks cut short. Shepherds spoke of creatures darting between their herds, quick shapes that moved too fast for the eye to catch, leaving carcasses drained of every drop of blood. Patrols discovered husks of cattle, their flesh stripped with surgical precision, bones stacked neatly as though arranged by hands that did not understand the meaning of mercy. It was as if the world itself had become a larder. Something unseen had begun its feast. The Arbits grew restless. Their ranks stretched thin as reports flooded in. They beat civilians for spreading tales of monsters. But the lash could not silence the truth when it was written in blood across the soil. Every morning, more bodies appeared, not whole, but scattered, disassembled, gnawed to fragments. At first, authorities attempted to burn the remains, hoping fire might erase the fear. But the pyres only fed the panic, smoke carrying the stench of ruin across entire districts. Priests doubled their sermons, their voices cracking as they demanded ever greater sacrifices to appease the emperor. the plazas filled with the sound of chanting, thousands of throats straining to drown out the silence of the skies. And yet, as the voices rose, the stars vanished further. The heavens once bright with constellations now lay hidden behind a dark haze, as though an unseen veil were spreading across the planet. Some said it was a dust storm. Others whispered that the stars themselves had been eaten. The governor still refused to believe. Surrounded by his inner circle, he raged at his generals for their weakness, accusing them of cowardice for even suggesting mobilization. He ordered propaganda pictcasts played across the hives, showing banners of the Imperial Aquila fluttering proudly, soldiers marching in perfect formation, servitors maintaining endless productivity. Yet the images were hollow. Everyone who watched them knew they were watching ghosts. Even the soldiers knew. For though they still stood at their posts, though they still drilled and fired their lasguns into practice ranges, there was no fire in their eyes. They had seen the ichor, the husks, the endless trails of claw marks that led ever closer to their walls. They had begun to sense the futility of orders issued by men who had never felt the shadow of true war. And when soldiers sense futility, discipline rots quickly. The first mutiny was small. A single squad in the northern bastion refused to march, demanding evacuation for their families instead. The Arbits executed them on the spot, broadcasting the spectacle across every hive to remind the people of obedience. But instead of quelling unrest, the execution fed it. For when blood is shed in the name of order, those who watch are reminded only of how fragile that order truly is. It was then, in the midst of confusion and denial, that the first great tremor shook the earth. Entire districts swayed as if the ground itself were breathing. In the manufactorums, machines groaned and fell silent as servitors collapsed, their augmetics spasming in synchrony with a pulse that came from below. People poured into the streets, convinced it was an earthquake. Yet the tremor did not end. It throbbed, steady and rhythmic, like the beating of a monstrous heart beneath the crust. The Magos. Biologists who studied the phenomenon returned pale and wordless. His notes, later recovered from his chambers, spoke of seismic disturbances that did not match tectonic activity. Instead, they traced patterns, webs of tunnels spreading beneath the soil, vast caverns opening where none had existed before. His last recorded words were a single phrase: "The ground itself is being eaten." That night the dreams grew unbearable. Whole families screamed themselves awake, their voices echoing across the hives. They dreamed of walls collapsing, of chitinous bodies pouring through fissures, of skies torn open by wings that blotted the sun. Children tore at their own skin in panic. Priests collapsed mid-sermon. Soldiers woke with their lasguns pressed to their own chins, unable to endure another night. And though the governor's decrees threatened flogging and exile, the whispers rose louder, carried through every street and every hall. The word Tyranid was no longer forbidden. It had become inevitable. The veil finally broke on a morning that should have been ordinary. The markets of High Varan were already alive with the noise of barter and clanging steel. Traders shouting over the hum of servolifts. Smoke curled upward from the manufactorum stacks. The familiar scent of promethium thick in the air. And yet, above it all, there was silence where the sky should have been alive with light. The haze that had lingered for weeks now stretched into an unbroken shroud, a false firmament that turned day into dusk. At first, people thought it was weather or perhaps ash from the manufactorums, but then the shroud moved. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, it rippled like the surface of a vast ocean. Eyes tilted upward, voices stilled. And then came the realization, spreading from throat to throat in terrified gasps. The sky was not a sky at all. It was alive. The first shapes broke through the haze in silence. Massive, organic forms descended like mountains given wings, their silhouettes blotting out what remained of the sun. Their hides glistened with a sheen of wet chitin, their movements fluid and purposeful, as though the atmosphere itself offered no resistance. And where they passed, the air warped, thickening with a stench like rotting meat carried on furnace winds. Panic erupted. Thousands poured into the streets, pointing, screaming, praying. Vox grills crackled with the governor's commands for calm. But no words could quiet the primal terror that took root in the hearts of men and women who now understood what had come for them. The Tyranids had arrived. From the upper spires, the first warning shots lanced into the sky. Hydra flak batteries roared, spewing streams of tracer fire into the haze. For a moment, the people clung to hope, believing their weapons might bring the beasts down. But the sky did not falter. The barrage lit the swarm only briefly, revealing more than eyes could bear. Countless shapes beyond counting, wings layered upon wings, claws glistening. Bodies shifting like a storm made flesh. The guns had not revealed weakness. They had revealed the scale of the nightmare. What fell upon the city was not battle, but infestation. Pods streaked downward in burning arcs, slamming into streets and plazas, cracking stonecrete like brittle bone. When they split, they did not reveal soldiers but birthing sacks. Spilling creatures that shrieked as though announcing their hunger to the stars. They fell upon the nearest humans without hesitation, rending them apart with sickle claws and dripping maws, their movements too fast to follow. Blood pooled in rivers, sluicing through gutters, staining banners of the Aquila as they fluttered in vain defiance. The Arbites fought with discipline. Shock mauls and shotguns raised, their formation holding for a heartbeat. But then the tide swept over them. Chitin met ceramite, flesh met iron, and in the space of seconds, the enforcers were shredded into unrecognizable remains. The crowd scattered. Families were trampled underfoot. Children were wrenched from their parents' arms. The plaza that had once been filled with hymns became a charnel ground. Its voxcasters still blaring prayers into a sky that no longer cared, deep within the governor's palace. Varus raged as reports flooded in. He shouted for reinforcements that would never arrive, for faith that would not hold. His generals bent over hololithic displays that flickered with static, their maps filling with red markers faster than they could be updated. There was no strategy, no plan of defense. There was only collapse. And yet, amid the chaos, there was a silence that carried more terror than screams. In the lower hablocks, entire districts fell quiet within minutes of the first pod's landing. No survivors fled, no signals escaped. Patrols sent to investigate found only blood-slit corridors and walls that pulsed as though breathing. Something had claimed those places entirely, and whatever it was, it left nothing human behind. By nightfall, the world of Lethas IV knew the truth it had denied. The Tyranids had not come for conquest. They had come to feed. And everything flesh, stone, faith, and memory alike was now nothing more than prey. The storm broke in full on the second day. By then, the skies over Lethas IV were no longer skies at all, but a living ceiling of wings and teeth. A storm front of organic mass that stretched horizon to horizon. The air itself tasted different, sharp and metallic, filled with a tang that stung the throat and made every breath feel borrowed. Entire districts choked on the stench of burning, promethium and rotting flesh, as the swarm poured downward in an unending rain of pods and spores. In Hive Varen, the walls of the great bastion thundered with the roar of heavy bolters and the shriek of Laskin on fire. Lines of the Astra Militarum braced against the tide, their last guns spitting red beams into the shadows. From a distance, it looked as though the soldiers were holding their discipline unbroken, their volleys precise. But up close, the truth revealed itself. For every creature that fell, writhing, 3 more appeared in its place, crawling over the corpses of their kin without pause. The swarm advanced not like an army, but like a flood, heedless of losses. Unstoppable in momentum. The soldiers fought bravely, but bravery against hunger meant nothing. The first lines collapsed under the weight of sheer numbers. Their ranks swallowed whole as claws punched through flak armor as acid blood hissed against flesh. Voxgrills screamed with overlapping calls for aid, for ammunition, for the Emperor's mercy, until the channels dissolved into a single static howl. Officers tried to rally, their voices breaking as they barked orders drowned out by the shrieks of the dying dot in the Manufactorum district. Workers armed with little more than shock staves and tools found themselves face to face with the swarm. They fought not as soldiers but as cornered animals, jabbing, slashing, screaming. Some struck down their foes, only to be crushed beneath the weight of bodies that came in endless succession. Others fled, vanishing into alleys where spores fell like rain, searing their lungs until they collapsed, gasping in pools of blood. Those who survived for a few minutes longer watched as their homes were split open by chitinous beasts. Their habs turned into feeding grounds before their very eyes. And above it all, the sky thundered with the fury of the Imperial Navy. The fleet stationed in orbit descended in full wrath, their broadsides vomiting fire into the heavens. Columns of plasma seared the atmosphere, tearing holes in the great living cloud of the swarm. For a moment, entire stretches of the Tyranid canopy burned away, the sight greeted by cheers from the ground, but the cheers faded quickly. For as soon as one hole opened, another shadow filled it. The swarm was too vast, too unending. Where the Navy's firepower annihilated hundreds, thousands more pressed forward, and as the minutes dragged on, the ammunition stores began to dwindle. The fleet's strength was measured in hours, not days. On the streets, faith collapsed with terrifying speed. The plazas once filled with prayer now erupted in chaos, citizens trampling each other in their desperation to flee. Priests who once thundered of the Emperor's protection found themselves drowned beneath panicked crowds.
Ow.
Their relics torn from their hands by those who believed them useless charms. Even the arbits, once iron symbols of order, faltered. Their shock mauls crackled weakly, their formations breaking as the flood of flesh crashed against them. The horror was not only in what was seen, but in what was heard. The swarm did not roar or bellow like beasts of old. It chittered, a constant chorus of clicking, scraping, grinding sounds that burrowed into the skull and made thought itself feel fragile. The noise grew louder as the swarm drew closer, until it seemed to come from inside the ears, inside the blood. Men shot wildly into shadows, their discipline shattered, desperate to silence the sound that could not be silenced. By nightfall, the hive's outer walls had been breached. The Tyranids poured inward through fissures torn open by their monstrous organisms, spilling into the city like rivers of black oil. The defenders fell back street by street, turning every intersection into a killing ground. But every barricade that held for minutes was overrun in seconds. Every strong point drowned in acid and blood. And still the swarm pressed on, tireless, endless, unfeeling. The firestorm had begun, and there was no end in sight. The hive burned from within. Where once the manufactoria churned out shells, armor plating, and the endless tools of war, now only ruin remained. Promethium fires spread unchecked, igniting hab blocks like paper and turning avenues into rivers of flame. The sky above glowed a dull crimson, smoke blotting out even the faintest glimpse of stars. The city had become a furnace, but the swarm did not falter. They advanced through fire, their carapaces blackened, their bodies sizzling with acid and ash. They did not fear death, because death had no meaning. Civilians, caught between the flames and the swarm, fled deeper into the hive. Mothers dragged their children through choking smog, fathers clutched heirlooms that meant nothing now, and gangs of desperate men tore food from each other's hands. The weak fell, trampled underfoot, or abandoned in alleys. Yet for every dozen that perished in flight, one managed to find cover clinging to survival in basements, tunnels, or broken rail stations. These few whispered prayers that no longer carried weight, prayers drowned by the swarm's chittering chorus. The Imperial Guard attempted counterattacks, launching from the hive's central barracks in armored columns. Chimera transports rumbled through debris-strewn streets, their turrets hammering bursts of fire into the shadows. For a heartbeat, it seemed possible that momentum could be seized, that steel and discipline might carve a wound in the tide. But then came the larger creatures, the hulking monstrosities bred for annihilation. Carnifexes barreled into the columns, their claws slicing tanks open as easily as flesh. Soldiers screamed as they were torn from their vehicles, ripped apart, and fed to the smaller broods swarming behind. The Vox channels erupted once more with pleas for reinforcements, for orbital strikes, for salvation. But the fleet above had its own horrors to contend with. Bioships drifted through the void like nightmare leviathans, their tentacles piercing the hulls of Imperial vessels, siphoning crew and fuel into their cavernous maws. The battle in orbit was no longer one of dominance, but of survival. Entire cruisers were silenced in minutes, their lights winking out like dying stars as the swarm consumed them piece by piece. Every loss above echoed below. Defenders realizing that no rescue was coming in the Underhive, where shadows were already thick and despair had long festered, panic turned feral. Food riots broke out as stores emptied, and makeshift gangs armed themselves with rusted pipes and looted stubbers. But even here, the swarm found them. The smallest organisms, skittering spider-like shapes, that slipped through cracks in the walls, flooded the tunnels. They descended on hiding families, stripping flesh in moments, leaving behind only bones slick with blood. For those who survived long enough to see it, the Underhive became a slaughterhouse. Its screams reverberating upward through the hive's foundations like the groans of a dying beast, amidst the chaos. The ecclesiarchy tried to rally faith. Preachers climbed upon burning pulpits, screaming of martyrdom, of standing firm in the Emperor's light. Some fought to the last, their flamer-tipped staffs incinerating swarms of lesser creatures before they themselves were torn apart. Others broke, their voices trembling, scripture forgotten as they fled with the same desperation as those they had once condemned as cowards. The Adeptus Arbits made their final stand in Precinct Bastion 22, fortress of ceramite and steel meant to be impregnable. The Arbites fought like fanatics, shotguns and suppression shields holding corridors against waves of Genostealers. For a time, they succeeded. Bodies piled waist-high at the doors, the bastion echoing with the thunder of disciplined volleys. But eventually, the walls cracked. Bioacid burned through steel. Monstrous claws smashed through barricades. And the last Vox signal from the bastion ended in static as the screams of its defenders were drowned in the chittering tide. Everywhere, hope died. Yet still, men and women fought. Some fired until their barrels melted, others swung blades until their arms gave out. They fought not because they believed they would win, but because they knew that to stop meant to be devoured. The firestorm consumed their faith, their cities, their lives, but not yet their will to resist. Not yet. By the third night of the invasion, the hive had become a graveyard wrapped in fire. Towers that had once stretched proudly toward the clouds now burned like torches. Collapsing into themselves in showers of steel and stone, the air was thick with smoke and spores, every breath tasting of ash and rot. Those who still lived spoke in whispers, as though sound itself might summon the swarm. Amidst this ruin, the Astra Militarum clung to discipline. Regiments that had once numbered in the tens of thousands now fought in shattered companies, spread thin across breach points and collapsed thoroughfares. Their commanders barked orders over failing Vox links, voices raw from smoke, while scribes clutched data slates recording casualty figures that grew meaningless with every passing hour. Ammunition dwindled, Lasgan cells scavenged from the dead, artillery pieces falling silent as their last shells were spent. Yet even in despair, they fought with grim determination. Bayonets fixed and banners held aloft, because surrender was a word that could not exist in the Emperor's lexicon. The Tyranids did not relent. Their assault patterns shifted constantly, adapting to every defense. A barricade that had held against Gaunts 1 hour would be stormed by leaping Genostealers the next. Positions thought secure were suddenly overrun by winged horrors dropping from above, their screeches piercing through the smoke like shards of glass. At times, it seemed the swarm knew the defenders' plans before they were even executed, as though the very hive mind anticipated every move, shaping its endless legions to exploit each weakness with merciless precision. In the hive's central plaza, the remains of the planetary governor's court attempted to maintain a semblance of authority. Surrounded by walls of fire and guarded by a dwindling company of household troops, the governor issued proclamations of resilience. His words, carried by the battered Vox network, spoke of victory, of the Emperor's undying light, of reinforcements already en route. But those who listened knew the truth. The governor's voice trembled, and the silence that followed his speeches was heavier than the words themselves. Morale could not be built on lies when the skies themselves betrayed them with the sight of burning ships falling from orbit in the spires above. The noble houses sealed their gates. For a brief time, they feasted on their stockpiles, clutching at illusions of safety while the city below perished. But the swarm was patient. It gnawed through bulkheads, sent its smallest organisms crawling through air ducts and sewer lines. And when the first brood erupted into their banqueting halls, the slaughter was swift and merciless. Silk and gold were shredded, chandeliers toppled, and the songs of the aristocracy were drowned beneath shrieks of terror. In their desperation, the nobles realized too late that wealth offered no armor against hunger that devoured worlds. For the common folk, survival meant becoming ghosts. Families buried themselves beneath rubble, or dug into collapsed train tunnels where the air was stale and damp. They listened to the sounds above the pounding of monstrous feet, the rattle of gunfire, the echo of explosions, and prayed they would not be found. Some starved in silence, unwilling to risk scavenging. Others choked on smoke when fires spread through the ruins. Few lived long enough to see another dawn. Those who did were changed, their eyes hollow, their faith reduced to little more than a muttered word repeated like a charm. Terra. Terra, Terra, the Mechanicus priests, desperate to preserve their sacred machines, retreated into manufactoria vaults, sealing themselves behind blast doors. For days they chanted Binharic prayers, coaxing ancient reactors to maintain power, even as the swarm burrowed into the complex. But flesh always failed against hunger. When the doors finally fell, the screams of the skittery echoed through the corridors, their cybernetic limbs torn apart by organisms built to consume both steel and bone. The data archives burned, cogitators smashed into silence, and the Omnissiah's song on that world was cut short. It's extinguished like all else. Amid the inferno, there were still moments of defiance. A squad of Cadians held a bridge against waves of Gaunts, refusing to retreat though their numbers dwindled to a handful. When their last grenades were thrown and their rifles ran dry, they fought with bayonets and fists until they were buried beneath a mountain of chitin. A lone commissar, his coat aflame, dragged a wounded soldier into cover and fired his bolt pistol until the weapon jammed. His last words a curse spat into the swarm's face. These acts did not change the outcome, but they left imprints in the ash. Echoes of courage that would outlast the flesh of those who dared defy the inevitable. By dawn of the fourth day, the hive was lost. Entire sectors lay silent, their populations digested into biomass that flowed back toward the center, where great pools of liquefied flesh bubbled and steamed. The swarm built its living towers upon the ruins, spires of bone and sinew piercing the haze, as though mocking the monuments that once defined human ambition. From these structures, fresh organisms emerged, birthed from the corpses of the conquered. Every death strengthened the swarm. Every failure fed it. The firestorm had not merely destroyed a city. It had stripped away the illusion of humanity's permanence, reminding all who remained that life in the Imperium was fragile, always one breath away from extinction. And yet, even as the hive fell silent, pockets of resistance still clung to existence, their faith unbroken, their will unyielding. The swarm was vast, but the human spirit, though battered, refused to vanish entirely. It was this refusal, fragile, flickering, but real, that would carry into the next chapter of their nightmare. The hive was dead, but the war was not. Beneath the smoking ruins, deep within chambers carved long before the invasion, there remained pockets of life. These were the redoubts, the last bastions of defiance, where remnants of the Astra Militarum, fragments of noble households, and scattered civilians gathered in desperate communion. To speak of victory was folly. To speak of survival was all that remained. The first of these redoubts lay in the bones of the old transit networks. Vast tunnels that had once carried workers and ore carts now served as arteries of resistance. Here, dim lamps flickered against soot-stained walls, and soldiers shared rations with the civilians who clung to them like shadows. Every sound was amplified in that underworld, the drip of condensation, shuffle of boots, the distant rumble of collapsing structures above. Yet it was not silence they feared, but the chittering noise that seeped through cracks in the stone. A constant reminder that the swarm pressed ever closer. Commanders reorganized what remained of their forces, plotting ambushes with the precision of dying men who knew every move might be their last. They spoke in hushed tones over battered data slates, Vox units hissing with static as they mapped out choke points. There was no longer talk of counteroffensives. Only delay, only resistance, only the hope that buying a few more hours might matter somewhere beyond this ruined world. Rumors filtered through the ranks, whispers that astropathic distress calls had reached Terra, that the Astra Militarim's titanic war machine might yet stir, that reinforcements could break through the swarm. Whether these were lies, delusions, or true fragments of salvation, no one dared say. But the whispers were enough to keep lasguns steady in trembling hands. The second redoubt formed in the shadow of the Ecclesiarchy's grand basilica. Once a monument of faith, crowned with a gleaming spire, it was now a scarred fortress, stained glass windows shattered, its altars blackened by fire. Here, priests turned survivors into congregants, arming them with makeshift weapons and binding them together with sermons shouted over the roar of bombardments. The Emperor's name was invoked like a shield, chanted by hundreds huddled within those cracked walls, their voices rising against the swarm's endless hunger. In the glow of flickering candles, mothers clutched children, soldiers recited litanies with hands scarred by battle. Even the faithless found themselves mouthing the words. Too many? It was the only thing keeping madness at bay. Above them, Tyranids prowled. Gaunts tested the basilica's defenses, scuttling across the broken plaza, only to be met with volleys of less fire in the defiant boom of a surviving heavy bolter emplaced in the transept. Their bodies piled high, clogging the steps, yet the swarm always returned. Every night the defenders prayed the dawn would find them still breathing, and every dawn they awoke to new assaults. It was not a question of if the basilica would fall, but when. Still, until that moment came, its bells shattered, cracked, but still intact enough to toll, rang defiantly over the ruins. The sound carrying like a challenge against the alien hunger. The third, and perhaps most fragile redoubt, was not built on stone or steel, but secrecy. Scattered cells of survivors hid in hablock basements, sealed behind barricaded doors and whisper-thin walls. They had no weapons beyond knives, no banners beyond tattered cloths, no commanders save the most desperate among them. Yet in their obscurity they endured, slipping out only at night to scavenge supplies from corpse-strewn streets. Some returned with food or ammunition. Others never came back at all. For those who survived, each day was an act of stubborn defiance, a refusal to surrender even as their world crumbled around them. What united all these fragments, soldiers in tunnels, worshippers in basilicas, ghosts in the basements, was not hope of victory, nor belief in rescue. It was the shared understanding that their struggle mattered, even if no one lived to record it. To deny the swarm even one life, to fire one last shot, to speak one last prayer into the dark. This was their war now. A war of inches, of hours, of fragments. A war that would be remembered only if someone survived to tell of it. And in the depths of the hive, where smoke and ruin mingled with faith and desperation, the last redoubts prepared to endure. The tunnels grew colder with each passing day, as though the warmth of the world itself had been consumed alongside its people. In the deeper redoubts, soldiers huddled with civilians, their breath forming mist in the stale air. The walls dripped with condensation, the taste of rust and stone clinging to every mouthful of air. Yet in this subterranean darkness, there was still order, or the thin shadow of it. Patrols moved silently, lasguns cradled against their chests, eyes watching the black mouths of side tunnels where Tyranid scouts might emerge at any moment. Every hour was marked by tension, every minute by waiting. The commanders, weary men and women whose uniforms were tattered but whose resolve had not yet broken, fought battles of their own against despair. They traced maps on cracked slates, identifying choke points, ambush routes, fallback positions. Some believed their efforts futile, others clung to the hope that time itself was a weapon, that every day endured was a small victory against the swarm. In whispered meetings, they argued about whether to conserve ammunition or expend it in sudden strikes. Voices rose, tempers frayed, but each morning they emerged to face the tunnels together, because division would mean swift extinction. Above, the basilica continued its stand, and its defense became legend among the scattered cells below. Survivors who slipped into the tunnels spoke of the ringing of the great cracked bell, its tones carrying through smoke and ruin as though the emperor himself marked the hours. Those who heard it swore it gave them strength. The priests within the basilica, gaunt with hunger, refused to silence it, even as the swarm clawed at their gates. For them, the bell was a weapon as powerful as any bolter, a voice that reached beyond walls and fire, reminding the faithful they were not alone. Each night, the defenders at the basilica lit torches along its battlements, their glow defiant in the suffocating dark. The swarm struck harder in response, sending larger organisms against the gates. Beasts whose screeches split stone and whose claws carved trenches into sacred marble. Still, the doors held, reinforced with chains and prayers, bolstered by the bodies of those who fell in their defense. The plaza before the basilica became a charnel field. Layers of alien corpses rotting under the open sky, their stench mingling with incense that still smoldered within. The faithful claimed that smell itself was proof the emperor walked among them. For how else could the air remain breathable amidst so much death? In the hidden basements, the smallest redoubts struggled with a different war, the war of silence. Here, survivors dared not raise their voices. Children were gagged with scraps of cloth to muffle their cries. Meals were taken in whispers, and even prayer was offered with lips moving soundlessly. For the swarm had senses beyond mortal comprehension, and sound was a beacon. To speak was to risk being found. In these cramped holes, despair grew thick, suffocating. Some gave in to it, choosing the quiet of suicide rather than the horror of discovery. Others endured, driven by sheer spite, their eyes hollow, but their will unbroken. It was in one such basement that a rumor took hold, carried by a wounded guardsman who stumbled and half-dead from the surface. His tale spoke of a miracle, that high in the spires, a strike cruiser still lingered in orbit, its lances firing in brief bursts when the swarm parted, as though searching for survivors. He swore he had seen its silhouette through the smoke, a shadow of salvation against the void. The survivors clutched at his words, passing them from one mouth to another, reshaping them into hope. Whether the guardsman's mind had been broken by fever, or whether truth flickered in his story mattered little. Hope, even false, was nourishment in a world starving for light, and so the redoubts endured, not because they believed in survival, but because each hour of resistance felt like defiance against inevitability. Every lasbolt fired, every prayer whispered. Every scavenger who returned with a canister of water or a strip of protein ration became part of a greater defiance. They could not break the swarm, but they could deny it the quiet victory of despair. The redoubts were not strongholds in the traditional sense. They were sparks in the dark, and sometimes a spark, even in the blackest night, is enough to burn brighter than the void that surrounds it. The basilica's bell tolled for the last time on the 7th night. Its cracked bronze voice carried over the ruins in one long, mournful note before splintering into silence. In the tunnels below, soldiers paused mid-step. Civilians lifted their heads from their rags, and for a fleeting heartbeat, the entire hive seemed to hold its breath. Then the ground shook, and the swarm's chorus answered. The redoubt that had been the heart of resistance was dying at the gates. The defenders fought like zealots who knew the end was written, but would carve their names in the ashes regardless. Lasguns burned red streaks across the plaza, flamers spat gouts of holy fire, and the ancient heavy bolter thundered until its barrel warped and jammed. The Tyranids surged without pause, their bodies piling high until the steps ran slick with ichor. A carnifex crashed against the doors, its claws shattering chains, its bellow shaking stone foundations. Behind it, more poured forward, genestealers darting through the wreckage, hormagaunts leaping over the corpses of their kin, rippers swarming in blind, gnashing waves. Inside, the priests gathered the faithful before the altar. Their voices rose above the thunder of claws and the screams of the dying. They spoke not of fear but of glory, of standing in the emperor's gaze. Some among the congregation wept, others laughed with the madness of certainty. Children clung to their mothers as hymns filled the basilica one last time. And when the doors finally burst inward, when the swarm came flooding like a tidal wave of teeth and chitin, the defenders met them not in silence but in song. The hymn broke only when the last voice was torn apart. Word of the basilica's fall rippled through the tunnels like a toxin. Some clutched their weapons tighter, vowing to avenge the martyrs. Others felt their faith falter, despair spreading like rot in the dark. Commanders argued louder now, maps and strategies discarded in favor of raw survival. Without the basilica's defiance, the redoubts seemed less like strongholds and more like graves awaiting their sealing stone. In one tunnel, a detachment of guardsmen attempted to strike back. Launching a desperate raid on a spawning pool the swarm had erected in the ruins of a manufactorum. They fought with fury, grenades blasting apart mounds of pulsing flesh, the fire boiling the ichor that frothed from birthing sacs. For a brief moment, it seemed possible they might succeed in destroying the nest, but the hive mind responded instantly. Warrior creatures descended from the ruins above, their scything talons slicing through armor as if it were parchment. The guardsmen were slaughtered to the last, their sacrifice adding only another trickle of biomass to the pool they had sought to destroy. The hidden basements fared little better. Silence, once their shield, became suffocating. Children starved, elders wasted away, and every trip above ground to scavenge claimed more lives. When a brood of gaunts finally sniffed out one such cellar, the massacre was swift and merciless. The swarm tore through barricades as if they were paper, dragging the screaming survivors into the open. A few managed to flee, stumbling blindly into the ruins, but most were consumed. Their bones, like so many others, were left to bleach beneath the hive's burning towers. And yet not all fell at once. In the deepest tunnels, where the air was heavy with damp and the walls trembled with distant impacts, one redoubt held longer than the rest. Here a company of guardsmen and a scattering of civilians fortified a collapsed station. Using wrecked trains as barricades and sealing entrances with rubble, their food was meager, their ammunition dwindling. But they endured. They spoke of the basilica's defenders with reverence, swearing to buy as much time as possible. They knew they were the last, and there was something sacred in that knowledge. Still, even in the dark, the swarm pressed closer. Strange sounds echoed through the tunnels, the chitter of unseen creatures, the wet scrape of claws on stone, the hiss of acid-searing rock. Every hour the walls seemed thinner, every moment a countdown toward the inevitable breach. The last redoubts were crumbling, their sparks fading one by one. Soon, only embers would remain, scattered in the ash of a world already half digested. But embers, even in their fragility, can still burn. The last redoubt held longer than anyone expected. In the ruined station beneath the hive, where collapsed tunnels formed natural choke points, the defenders carved out a semblance of order. Wrecked railcars became barricades, sandbags were piled high with trembling hands, and the surviving tech priests rigged the shattered lights to flicker dimly from scavenged power cells. It was not a fortress, it was a tomb waiting to be sealed. But within those walls, men and women still breathed. And so long as breath remained, resistance endured. The commander of the station, a scarred veteran whose name the soldiers spoke only in whispers, walked the line each day, offering neither comfort nor lies. His voice was harsh, his orders absolute, but in his presence there was certainty. Hold, he told them, always the same word. Hold and deny them. For some, that single command became a mantra, repeated silently in the dark when despair crept close. Each assault tested the station more fiercely. Gaunts flooded the tunnels in screeching waves, their bodies piling high against the barricades. Flamers roared, lasguns burned, and bayonets thrust until the floor ran slick with ichor. When the walls trembled with the impact of larger beasts, the defenders braced themselves, their eyes wide with terror, but their hands steady. Twice the barricades nearly collapsed, saved only by grenades hurled into the mass at the last possible moment. The air grew foul with smoke and blood, every breath rasping in lungs already raw from hunger. The civilians, though untrained, found roles in the defense. Children carried water from the dripping walls. Women hauled spent power packs to be recharged by failing generators, and the elderly whispered prayers as they patched wounds with trembling hands. No one was idle, because idleness meant thought, and thought meant despair. By labor, they endured another day. In the quiet hours between attacks, strange conversations filled the dark. Some spoke of Terra, of the Emperor's golden light, imagining that even now their pleas had reached his throne. Others whispered of salvation in the void of fleets gathering, of the Adeptus Astartes, descending with bolters blazing to scour the swarm. A few dared to wonder if perhaps this was not the end, but the test of their faith. A crucible that might forge them into something greater. Yet there were also darker murmurs, tales of nightmares seen in fevered sleep, of shadows pressing at the edge of thought, of a hunger so vast it seemed to seep into their minds. These whispers were silenced quickly, for to give them voice was to invite despair. When the end finally came, it was not sudden, but slow. The swarm did not rush the barricades with overwhelming force. It seeped into the tunnels like a tide. Small creatures infiltrated the cracks, scuttling unseen until they struck from within. One by one, sentries were dragged screaming into the dark, their rifles clattering uselessly on the stone. Panic spread, the barricades weakening not from outside assault, but from the fear that spread within. The commander rallied them, his voice iron against the chaos. They fought room by room, rail car to rail car, until the station itself seemed alive with fire and screams. Bolts tore through alien flesh, blades clashed against chitin, and grenades shook the walls with thunder. But the swarm was endless. For every creature slain, another surged forward. Born from the endless biomass gathered above, the defenders fell in clusters, consumed beneath the press of claws and teeth. In the end, the commander stood alone at the last barricade, his coat torn, his body bloodied. With his final round spent, he drew his blade and hurled himself into the tide, his roar echoing against the stone as the swarm swallowed him whole. His sacrifice bought only minutes, but minutes were precious in a world measured in moments of resistance. The station was lost, as all the redoubts before it had been. The basilica's hymn, the tunnel's discipline, the basement's silence, all extinguished now, reduced to memory. Yet their defiance lingered in the ruin, etched into the stone, carried in the smoke that still drifted upward toward the shattered spires. The swarm had devoured their bodies, but not their refusal to surrender. That refusal was eternal, a spark cast into the void, and as the hive fell utterly silent, as the last redoubt crumbled into darkness, the world itself seemed to pause. For though the swarm had consumed everything of flesh and stone, something intangible remained, a defiance not easily digested. It was this lingering spark, fragile and flickering, that whispered of what came next. The hive was silent now. Where once 1 billion voices had filled the air with their noise footsteps, markets, sermons, the ceaseless thunder of industry, now only the low chittering of alien limbs remained. The swarm fed in silence, stripping flesh, cracking bone, drinking the marrow of a world that had believed itself eternal. Yet silence was never total in the void. High above the planet, where the shattered orbital stations drifted like corpses in a sea of black, something moved. Broken holes turned lazily on their axes, lightless windows staring down at the ruin below. Among them lurked the shadows of greater shapes, the remnants of ships. Their prows torn open, their keels snapped like brittle bone. The void was a graveyard, and every shattered vessel bore mute witness to the futility of defiance. But hidden within that graveyard, other shapes moved as well. They were not Tyranid organisms, not part of the living tide. They were steel and adamantium, cloaked in the dark, their drives cold, their hulls masked against detection. The last Imperial vessels, a pitiful handful, lay adrift in the shadow of broken stations. They had survived the first onslaught not by valor, but by concealment, scavenging what little fuel and air remained. These ships were ghosts, and their crews little more than echoes of men, sustained by hope and rationed oxygen from the bridge of one such vessel. The Ferrum Obscura, Captain Lysander, watched the planet turn slowly beneath him. His eyes were sunken, his uniform torn and stained. But his posture remained rigid, as though discipline alone could hold back the void. "They have consumed the hive," he murmured, though none needed the reminder. The words were ritual, spoken to make the horror real. Soon they will turn their eyes upward. Around him, the bridge crew stared at hollow screens, watching as Tyranid spores drifted higher into the upper atmosphere. The swarm was not yet fully turned to the stars, but it was only a matter of time. Already, vast shapes coiled beyond the clouds, bioships, their flesh shimmering in the void. Each was a living leviathan, larger than any Imperial cruiser, their tendrils spreading like roots through the atmosphere. The void was becoming their ocean, and the planet merely their reef. The survivors aboard the Ferrum Obscura whispered of salvation, but their voices carried no conviction. They spoke of reinforcements from the Segmentum Command, of the Astra Militarum rallying beyond the warp storms, of a fleet massing that would one day sweep in and break the swarm. Yet Lysander knew better. He had fought too many campaigns, seen too many promises of rescue dissolve into ash. The Imperium was vast, but it was not infinite, and in the cold calculus of survival, one hive world could be spent like coin. Still, he kept those doubts locked within. To speak them aloud would be treason to his crew, treason to their thin thread of endurance. Instead, he gave orders in a voice of iron, commanding ration cycles, stealth protocols, and constant vigilance. "We endure," he told them, echoing the word that had become litany on the surface below. "So long as we endure, we deny them." But endurance was fragile in the void. Supplies dwindled. Air recyclers groaned. Power cells dimmed one by one until entire decks were sealed off. Their crews huddled in the dark, breathing shallowly as the heat bled away. Mutiny simmered in whispers, and more than once, Lysander had drawn his sidearm in the quiet of the corridors, silencing voices that would have doomed them all. Discipline was survival, and survival was all that remained. Still, the void held secrets beyond the swarm. Far out among the debris fields, faint signals flickered on dying O-spec screens, distress beacons too weak to reach beyond the system. Each was a cry in the dark, a remnant of ships lost in the first wave. Some were already silent, their power drained, their crews long since expired. Others still whispered faintly, promising survivors adrift in steel coffins. Lysander ordered search parties into the wreckage, scavenging not only supplies, but people. They returned with hollow-eyed men and women, their sanity fractured, their faith in tatters. Yet even broken souls added to the crew's number. And numbers meant another day of resistance. Above the dead hive, beneath the shadow of the Leviathans, these scattered ships clung to existence. They were not victors, nor even defenders. They were carrion birds in a graveyard, surviving by secrecy, while the swarm prepared its feast. And yet, in that frail survival, there was meaning. For though the swarm had consumed a world, it had not yet consumed the will of those who watched from the dark, and sometimes in the endless night. That will was enough. The first time the survivors saw the hive fleet stir in the void, a silence fell heavier than any rationed breath. The bioships that had hovered like dormant leviathans now began to pulse with a slow rhythm. Bioluminescence flickering beneath their carapaces as though some great heart had awakened. Tendrils uncoiled, twitching through the upper atmosphere. And swarms of smaller organisms poured from their orifices, drifting downward toward the planet and upward into the black. It was movement without sound, but it carried the weight of inevitability. The sky itself seemed to ripple with hunger. Lysander watched through the cracked hololith, his gaunt face illuminated by the ghostly glow. The bridge crew shifted uneasily, some pressing fingers to rosaries of bone or fragments of the Imperial Aquila carved into their palms. Faith had become the only ration that never ran out, though its taste grew bitter with each passing day. "They reach for us," Lysander whispered, and though he did not raise his voice, the words carried across the silent deck like a funeral bell. The Ferrum Obscura had survived by stealth. But stealth was no shield against inevitability. The void belonged to the swarm now, and every movement of the fleet felt like the tide advancing upon a trapped shoreline. Still, desperation forged strange resolve. Lysander summoned his officers and outlined what was unspoken. If they remained hidden, discovery would be certain. and when discovery came, annihilation would follow. If they struck first, if they dared a blow against the Leviathans themselves, perhaps they could buy time. A final act of defiance before the end. The plan was madness, and all aboard knew it. The Ferrum Obscura was a battered frigate with half her weapons stripped for power and her crew wasted by hunger. Against a single Tyranid bioship, she would be nothing more than ash. Yet madness was the only coin left to spend, and so the officers bowed their heads in grim assent. They would strike not to win, but to wound. To scar the swarm, to remind the void that mankind, even in its dying breath, could still draw blood. Preparations began in silence. Munitions were counted, torpedoes primed with unstable warheads salvaged from wrecks. Void shields were coaxed into flickering readiness, though every tech priest warned they would not last against the first strike. Prayers were chanted over each shell and each gunner, words to bind failing flesh with iron resolve. The crew moved like phantoms, each knowing that the labor of their hands might never bear fruit, yet compelled by the strange dignity of resistance. Beyond the ship's hull, the void was alive with alien light. Mycetic spores drifted like pollen across a cosmic sea, and distant shapes writhed with organic purpose. One Leviathan drew closer, its immense form blotting stars as it exhaled clouds of feeder organisms into the black. Its surface writhed with chitinous ridges and pulsating sacs, a horror both vast and intimate, as though the planet itself had taken wing. This would be their target. A foe too great for them to kill, yet not too great for them to wound. The Ferrum Obscura stirred from her hiding place, drives igniting in bursts so faint they seemed like the twitch of a dying ember. She slid from the shadows of wreckage, hull scarred, prow jagged, her machine spirit groaning at being roused to war once more. On the bridge, the crew sat at their stations, faces pale, hands steady. The gunnery deck swam in incense smoke, each shell loaded with a whispered benediction. Lysander took his place at the command throne, spine straight, eyes unblinking. "By his will we strike," he said. The words echoed through vox channels like a last confession. The Leviathan loomed, unaware of the gnat that crept toward its flank. The torpedoes launched first, streaking through the black entrails of fire, their warheads armed with scavenged wrath. They struck against the beast's chitin, and the void blossomed in fire. For an instant, it seemed the impossible had been achieved. Cracks spidered across alien plates, ichor spilling into the stars. The Leviathan shuddered, its bioluminescence flaring with sudden pain. A wound, shallow yet real. Proof that it could bleed. But victory was a fragile illusion. From the Leviathan's surface erupted clouds of spore creatures, a living shield that swarmed toward the frigate. Lances of bioplasma arced from its orifices, shearing through the void in incandescent fury. The Ferrum Obscura staggered, her void shields collapsing in the first salvo, hull plates torn from her spine. Crew were flung screaming into the abyss, their voices cut short by silence. Alarms wailed, corridors filled with flame. But the frigate held her course, guns still barking in defiance. In the shadow of the Leviathan, one fragile vessel clawed at eternity, daring to leave a scar upon the monster that devoured worlds. And in that moment, brief as a heartbeat, the swarm turned its gaze upon the last flicker of mankind adrift in the void. The first impact tore through the midships. Bulkheads screamed as molten bioplasma ripped into steel, venting compartments into the abyss. Dozens of crew vanished in an instant, their bodies pulled into the cold black, their last cries swallowed by silence. The Ferrum Obscura groaned like a wounded beast, her machine spirit keening in vox echoes, so the vessel itself understood that it had been marked for death. Yet she endured. Men and women staggered through smoke-filled corridors, sealing hatches, dragging wounded comrades from the flames. They did not cry out in despair. They labored with grim determination, for to fall into panic was to dishonor the sacrifice already made. In the gunnery decks, half-blinded crews clung to their stations, loading shells with burned hands, firing blind into the void. Every round that struck the Leviathan was a prayer made manifest, refusal to be forgotten. Captain Lysander stood unflinching at the command throne, though blood ran down his cheek from a shattered console. His voice was iron, steady in the maelstrom. Maintain course. Maintain fire. Each word carried through the vox like a litany, anchoring the dying ship in discipline. To falter now would be to let their scar vanish, to let the Leviathan shrug off their defiance as if it had never been. The frigate's torpedo bays spat one last volley, their tubes melting from the strain. The warheads struck true, detonating deep within the wounds already torn into the bioship's flank. For an instant, the stars were drowned in ichor and flame. The Leviathan convulsed, its immense body twisting, limbs thrashing as fluid boiled into the void. Even the swarm around it faltered, sensing pain ripple through the synapse web. It was not death, never death, but it was agony, and that was enough. The price, however, was absolute. A second lance of bioplasma cut across the Ferrum Obscura, cleaving her whole from stern to prow. The bridge shuddered violently, consoles exploding in cascades of sparks. Lysander was hurled from his throne, striking the deck with a crack of bone. Around him, officers burned, melted into their stations by the fury of alien fire. The ship's spine broke, splitting apart as compartments crumpled like paper under the crushing force of the void. Still, fragments of her guns fired, crew clinging to rituals even as fire consumed them. One by one, vox channels went silent, extinguished by rupture and flame. Yet amid the collapse, some voices remained, whispering prayers, shouting curses, declaring loyalty to Terra with their last breath. It was defiance given form, 1,000 sparks igniting against the tide. In the final moments, Lysander dragged himself upright, blood filling his lungs. He staggered to the shattered viewport, gazing at the Leviathan's wound. Through the drifting haze of flame and bone, he saw the great beast reel, ichor streaming like rivers of fire. His lips curved into a broken smile. He had not won, could not win, but he had scarred the monster. He had proved that, even in death, humanity could still strike back. The Ferrum Obscura split in two, her remains scattering across the stars. Some fragments burned in atmosphere, falling as streaks of fire upon the ruined hive below. Others drifted in silence, cooling in the dark, unmarked save for the Aquila scorched into their plating. To the Tyranids they were nothing but debris. To mankind, they were martyrdom. And among that wreckage, life clung stubbornly still. Escape pods cast adrift in the chaos, drifted into the void. Their occupants huddled in silence, their breaths shallow, their eyes wide as alien shadows passed around them. Some pods were torn apart by spore creatures before they could even flee. Others slipped into debris fields cloaked by ruin, their faint transponders whispering into the dark. Those who survived knew their fate was no reprieve. They would either die slowly in the void or be found by the swarm. Yet even so, they endured, for endurance was all that remained. Far below, on the world already devoured, fragments of the frigate rained from the heavens. No survivors on the surface looked up through smoke and ash to see trails of fire crossing the sky. Some whispered that the Emperor himself had sent a sign, that the fleet still fought above them, that their prayers had been heard. Others saw only the truth, a requiem written in flame, marking the end of the last defenders. But no matter what they believed, one truth remained undeniable. Humanity had not gone quietly into the void. In the maw of the swarm, on a battlefield, already lost, they had raised their banners of defiance and struck a wound into the Leviathan. It would heal. The Hive Fleet would feed again, yet the scar would remain, carried with it into the next war, the next world, the next devouring, and perhaps somewhere far beyond. Someone would see the wound and know that men and women of Terra's scattered empire had dared to resist. The void returned to silence after the last flames of the Ferrum Obscura guttered out. The Leviathan recoiled, wounded but unbroken, its titanic body flexing as it exhaled clouds of feeder spores into the black. Round it, lesser organisms swirled, in disciplined arcs, seeking, sensing, devouring the fragments that dared drift free. To the swarm, the battle was no more than a tremor in an ocean, a ripple swallowed by the tide, yet the wound remained, etched into its hide. Burning faintly in the starlight, a mark of defiance, carried into the abyss. Among the wreckage, a handful of escape pods drifted unseen. Their hulls were scorched, their life support failing. Their guidance systems little more than sparks sputtering against entropy. Inside, the survivors whispered in the dim glow of failing consoles. Some clung to rosaries, others to rusted lasguns. That would never fire again, as though the weight of steel could anchor them against despair. Their breaths fogged in the freezing air, each exhalation a ghost curling in the cramped dark. Days passed, or perhaps only hours. Time lost meaning in the lightless void. Hunger gnawed, water ran low, and the cold seeped through the thin walls like a predator that needed no teeth. Some pods went silent one by one, their systems drained, their occupants succumbing to the stillness, yet others clung on, waiting for deliverance that would never come. It was in those final hours that whispers spread among the survivors. Some claimed to hear voices in the void, hymns carried through static, the Emperor's promise echoing from the stars. Others swore they saw lights flicker in the debris fields, golden flares gliding like angels on hidden wings. Perhaps it was the last fever dream of dying minds, or perhaps something more. But the whispers grew until even the most hardened veterans closed their eyes and listened. It was easier than admitting the truth. They were alone. And no fleet was coming. Still, even in despair, a strange unity formed. They spoke in low tones of the Ferrum Obscura, of Captain Lysander's final defiance, of the wound burned into the Leviathan's flesh. They told each other that scars mattered, that though their lives would end, the proof of resistance would endure. To die nameless was to be forgotten, but to die fighting was to be eternal. And so, the pods drifted in silence, not as lost souls, but as fragments of a greater whole, the last echoes of a world already consumed. The Leviathan, sated by destruction, began to turn its immense bulk outward, away from the ravaged world. It unfurled tendrils like sails, sensing the void beyond, the call of distant stars. The swarm had devoured one planet, and already its hunger sought the next. The ruined world, once proud with hives and manufactura, was now little more than a husk, oceans drained, mountains hollowed. Cities nothing but skeletal ruins picked clean by chittering swarms. Nothing would rise there again. Crops, no prayers, no banners of the Aquila. The world had been erased from the ledger of the Imperium, its memory destined to fade into silence. But above that husk, in the drifting dark, faint signals still pulsed from the pods. Weak, flickering, almost too faint to notice, yet they endured. To the Tyranids, they were insignificant, overlooked by the will of the synapse. To mankind, they were candles in the dark, proof that even the smallest embers could resist the swallowing tide. And somewhere beyond the system, in the endless black, where astropaths strained their minds against the storm of the warp, those faint echoes might yet be heard. Perhaps a garbled fragment would reach some listening post. Perhaps some wandering patrol would catch a dying pulse and know that. In this system, a world had fallen not in silence but in fire. For that was the truth of humanity in the age of the Imperium. Worlds would fall, fleets would shatter, armies would vanish into the jaws of the great devourer. But always, somewhere, someone would endure long enough to leave a scar, to send a whisper, to carve defiance into the dark. A high fleet would feed again. The swarm would stretch across galaxies, yet no matter how many billions were consumed, the will of man would remain like a nail driven into the flesh of eternity. And as the pods drifted, carried by the currents of wreckage, the survivors stared. Through frost-lined glass, at the Leviathan's fading silhouette. Their bodies trembled, their breaths grew thin, but their eyes still burned. Even in silence, they dared to hope that their suffering would mean something, that their endurance, their scar, their whisper in the void would not vanish. For in the shadow of the swarm, when all else is stripped away, what remains is this. Mankind does not go quietly. There is a silence deeper than death, a silence not of absence, but of distance. In the void between stars, where the light of suns dims into pale dust and no Vox signal can carry unbroken, there lies the gulf that separates man from salvation. For those adrift in escape pods, battered fragments of the Ferrum Obscura, that gulf was all that remained. Their world was gone, their ship was gone. The High Fleet had turned away, its titanic leviathans drawing into the black, driven by a hunger that no single planet could sat. Yet the survivors drifted still, their eyes hollow, their bodies stiffened by cold, their breath shallow and precious. Some whispered prayers to the Emperor, voices cracking from thirst. Others stared in silence, watching faint stars blur through frost-lined glass, their thoughts already half-claimed by the void. But always there was the Astronomicon, a flame no Tyranid could extinguish, though none of the survivors could see it, though its light could not pierce their broken auspex or frost-fogged vision. They felt its presence in the marrow of their souls. It was the beacon that had guided them from birth. The proof that mankind was not alone, that somewhere upon distant Terra, the Emperor still endured upon his golden throne. Even as the swarm stripped their world to ash, even as the void gnawed at their sanity, that flame flickered within them. Some called it madness, others called it faith, yet it was the one light that could not be consumed. Among them was Sister Marion, once of the Order of the Argent Veil, her armor long since stripped for survival, her hands wrapped in cloth torn from a dead comrade's robes. She led no sermons, for her throat was raw and her strength failing, but her presence steadied those who shared her pod. When men despaired, she recited fragments of litanies, her voice quiet but unshaken. When women wept, she pressed their hands against the frozen Aquila carved into the pod's wall. "He endures," she whispered, again and again, and so must we. Her words carried beyond her pod, for Vox systems still crackled faintly between the drifting shells. Survivors traded fragments of speech, half-broken, yet each syllable a lifeline cast across the dark. One pod whispered of strange lights glimpsed near the wreckage fields. Another swore they had heard hymns in the static, the Astronomicon's echo bleeding through the void. Whether delusion or miracle, no one could say. But it bound them, held them, gave their endurance a shape. Days, perhaps weeks, passed without measure. Some pods went silent, their occupants claimed by cold or hunger. Others drifted on, waiting for the improbable hand of salvation. And through it all, the survivors clung to the Astronomica, unseen but never absent. They imagined its flame burning above Terra, guiding fleets across the stars, binding humanity in defiance against the dark. Even here, on the edge of annihilation, they believed it might still carry their whispers to someone. Somewhere beyond the abyss, far across the galaxy. Astropaths strained in chambers thick with incense, their minds bleeding as they wrestled against the storms of the warp. Most signals were lost, shredded by madness and distance. Yet sometimes amid the storm faint echoes reached them, fragments of voices, names, prayers, coordinates lost in static. They could never know from where the fragments came, or if those who sent them still lived. But the Astronomicon caught them all, its eternal flame carrying every whisper into the void. Perhaps among those fragments, faint as a dying breath, lay the signals of the Ferrum Obscurus survivors. Perhaps even as they drifted unseen. Their existence had already been etched into the Emperor's light. No Tyranid could hear that flame. No Leviathan could comprehend it. Yet it endured, and in that endurance lay the one thing the swarm could never devour. For flesh and worlds could be consumed, memories erased, banners burned, but faith burned differently. Faith was not matter. Faith was not bone. Faith was the ember that survived long after the fire was gone. And so, in the silent dark, the pods drifted, frozen and dying, yet not extinguished. For beyond their failing eyes, beyond the walls that cracked with cold, beyond the ruin of their world, a beacon still burned. The Astronomicon, the Emperor's will, the eternal flame of mankind. And in that flame, their suffering was not in vain. The pods continued their endless drift. Small sparks lost against the immeasurable black. Time became a formless thing, no longer measured by the turning of suns or the chiming of ships' bells, but by breaths, by heartbeats, by the moments when hope flickered and nearly died. Hunger clawed at the survivors. Water ran out. The frost spread across their lips and eyes, and many slid quietly into stillness. But still the whispers moved between the pods. Faint clicks of the Voxnet, that carried fragments of prayers and words that were more than human. They were defiance itself. Terra endures. The throne burns eternal. We are seen. We are not forgotten. It mattered little whether the words were true. What mattered was that they traveled, hopping from one pod to the next, a litany stitched into the void. Where one pod fell silent, another carried the echo forward. Where one soul gave up, another clutched the ember tighter. It was as though the Astronomicon itself wove through their voices, staining a choir too scattered to ever meet. There were times when the survivors swore they heard it more directly, a deep, resonant pulse beneath their thoughts. Not sound, but sensation, like the heartbeat of the galaxy itself. Some dismissed it as delirium. Others believed it. The Emperor's voice. Sister Marion, though weak, spoke only this: "The flame does not speak. And to feel it is to remember that you still live." In the frozen dark, such words became scripture. Among the pods, strange visions were reported. One survivor described seeing great winged forms drifting just beyond the glass, their bodies woven from light, their eyes endless. Another whispered that a hand had pressed against the hull from the outside, a hand of fire, leaving no mark but warming the pod for a moment before vanishing. Whether truth or hallucination, these tales spread across the Vox. No one asked if they were real, for reality was a fragile concept in the void. Belief was stronger. It was said that the Astronomicon was not merely a light, but a shield, a binding of souls as much as stars. Perhaps that was why so many of the lost clung to visions, why their hallucinations aligned in fragments of shared imagery. It was not madness alone. It was resonance, far away on ships that navigated by the Astronomicon's blaze. Astropaths felt the faintest brush of sorrow, as though voices too weak to form words had brushed their minds. None could trace the source. Yet many wept without knowing why, their tears falling into censers heavy with incense. They knew only that humanity suffered, and the flame bore witness. The Tyranids could not feel it. They could not comprehend. Their hive minds operated on hunger, on calculation, on the cold consumption of flesh and DNA, but they lacked faith, and so they lacked the ability to silence what faith kindled. The Astronomicon's song was not for them. It was for mankind alone. And still, the pods drifted. Their courses shifted by gravity wells, by the faint push of solar winds. None could say where they would end, scattered into systems unknown or swallowed by stars. But there remained the faintest hope that one would cross a patrol's path, that some fragment of humanity's vast fleets would stumble upon them, hear their calls. Some believed that the Emperor guided such things, that no pod drifting with his light could ever truly be lost. Others argued that such thoughts were comfort alone, that faith could not alter vectors or pierce the void. Yet even those cynics found themselves reciting the whispered litanies, their tongues moving in prayer while their minds denied belief. The Astronomicon's echo was not something one could resist. It sank too deep. In the endless silence, when the last of the food was gone, when the frost claimed voices one by one, still the beacon remained. Those who yet breathed could not see Terra, could not hear the golden throne, but they felt it all the same. It was not a light their eyes could see. It was a flame that burned in the marrow, a certainty that mankind still endured, and that they endured with it. And so the pods, shattered and broken, became not tombs but reliquaries, vessels carrying faith through the void. For long after flesh failed and bones froze, the Astronomicon would still echo within them. No Tyranid could consume that. No void could silence it. Humanity, scattered and bleeding, would remain bound together by whispers, by prayers, by flame.